Moving on to Dimir, we will start with Artful Takedown. Artful Takedown is a 4-minute instant. Choose one or both. Tap target creature, or target creature gets -2/-4 until end of turn. This is a reasonably good limited removal spell. We certainly, as we have seen various times through this review, have much better options at the same or lower mana in Constructed. Darkblade Agent is a 3-mana 2/3. As long as you've surveilled this turn, Darkblade Agent has Death Touch, and whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card. This actually seems like an exceptionally good limited card. We do have better options than this for Constructed, as we will get to in a second. But this is actually a really cool dynamic, and the fact that like when it deals combat damage, draw a card plays well with other cards like Lazav. But we have a better option that we'll take a look at in a minute. Disinformation Campaign. This is a really cool card. So this is a 3-mana enchantment. When Disinformation Campaign enters the battlefield, you draw a card and each opponent discards a card. Whenever you surveil, return Disinformation Campaign to its owner's hand. So this is a recurring source of value. It's reasonably slow. It doesn't impact the board, but in slower matchups, this can certainly be one of the more powerful things going on. I would definitely expect this to, at minimum, be a card that you like sideboard in 4 of, in like mid-range or control mirrors to just grind people into dust. Because like in certain matchups, this card is bonkers, but when you're playing against like a Boros deck or a Nullhide Ferox deck, for example, this card is a bit of a liability. So this is another example of a card that is very strong situationally. You can't main deck it, but that doesn't mean it's a bad card. When this card is good, it's exceptional. So I would definitely expect this to show up in sideboards a lot, and it's something you're going to have to take into consideration in post-board games against Dimir. Dimir Spybug. Dimir Spybug is a blue-black flying 1/1 with Menace. Whenever you surveil, put a +1/+1 counter on Dimir Spybug. Dimir Spybug is the other card I was talking about with like Lingering Phantasm. You can play the Surveils Matters aggro-ish deck where you curve like this and a Lingering Phantasm into Surveil and start pumping them, and you have your giant demon that surveils and you pump these. That's the kind of stuff Dimir Spybug will be played in. I think that if like that deck is good, this card will obviously see playing Constructed. I'm not sure if that deck will end up being good enough. Like how deep you want to go on the Surveil stuff is certainly questionable. It may be worth it to just do more incidental stuff and play just like the good cards. I don't know if this qualifies as one of those, probably not. But if you're going all in on the like Lingering Phantasm, Surveil, aggro-y stuff, this card is certainly a part of that equation. This card is very interesting. It's Etrata. You want to call it Errata, but it's Etrata. Etrata the Silencer is a 4-mana 3/5. It cannot be blocked. Whenever Etrata deals damage to a player, exile target creature that player controls and put a hit counter on that card. That player loses the game if they own 3 or more exiled cards with hit counters on them. Etrata owner shuffles it into their library. So the way this card works is you play Etrata, you attack with it, they can't block, you exile a thing, Etrata has to shuffle itself back into the deck, and you then have to redraw Etrata, play it again, attack with it again, and then do that another time, and then your opponent loses the game. You could also obviously like just be playing for Etrata and like Etrata attack, it shuffles, second main phase, play other Etrata, try and like do it that way. That's a reasonable thing to do. This card actually seems like reasonably playable just because the body's good. It's a 4-mana 3/5 that blocks a bunch. It can't be blocked, so you always get to attack and exile a creature, so it is at worst a removal spell. And you have the upside of, like, if you keep playing it, they just lose. So I don't hate Etrata, especially if you are playing it alongside the 2-mana Tutor with Undergrowth we were talking about before. You can play Etrata, like attack, exile a thing, and then tutor for the Etrata, replay the Etrata. There are certainly like a bunch of things you can do to enable this card, and like the floor isn't that low. It's like it's a 4-mana 3/5 that like when it deals damage, exiles a thing. So, like, if the floor on this card was lower, I would be more apprehensive. But the fact that it's just a 3/5 seems fine to me. Like, you just have a totally plausible card that isn't the worst thing in the world to play. And if you hit them 3 times, they lose. So, I would not be shocked to see people try and make a Trotta work, and I wouldn't be shocked if they had some level of success. House Guild Mage. House Guild Mage is the Dimir Guild Mage. This is probably the best of the Guild Mages as far as limited is concerned. You can pay 2 to tap a creature, doesn't untap, or 3 mana to surveil. Both of those are reasonably good situationally. Not something I think we are likely to see constructed, although this is borderline. Like, this one's close-ish. It would be for lack of better options, not because it really makes it on its own merit, but this could potentially fill a hole that the Dimir creature-based mid-range deck might be missing. Now we are at the guild leader of Dimir, Lazav the Multifarious. Lazav the Multifarious is a 2-mana, 1/3 legendary shapeshifter. When Lazav the Multifarious enters the battlefield, surveil 1. And you can pay X. Lazav the Multifarious becomes a copy of target creature card in your graveyard with converted mana cost X, except its name is Lazav the Multifarious, its legendary edition of other types, and it has this ability. Noteworthy that is not until end of turn when you activate Lazav. It's that until Lazav dies or you change it into something else. This is a card I actually think is pretty good. There are a lot of Dimir decks that would just be in the business of playing a 2-mana 1/3 that surveilled for 1, like we played Omen Seeker before, and this card's ceiling is much higher than that. Once you start milling over a lot of stuff and you get a decent selection of options in your graveyard, you can have situations where you have like a big creature and then a creature that gets value if it's the player. You attack with Lazav the Multifarious into their blocker. If they block, you make Lazav a big thing, eat their creature. If they don't block, you turn it into the value creature, get your value, kind of put them in a catch-22. That's an interesting dynamic you can foster with Lazav. It also gives you a bit of redundancy in seeing your important creatures. You can throw them into the bin off Surveil, dig deeper into the cards, but you still have access to that card through Lazav. So I actually think that this card is quite strong. You do have to invest the mana, but again, you can like invest it on end of turn, like on the end of their turn if you want to, like try and, if you think they have removal, or if they're leaving removal up, force it to use on their turn, untap, do something else. There's a lot of ways you can play with Lazav's ability that mitigate how mana intensive it is, and there's also a fair number of cheap creatures that are very good that you can just still multi-spell the turn you're doing Lazad stuff. A card we'll get to in a second, the strongest Dimir card in my opinion, plays very well with Lazav. This is not the card I was talking about, but this card is pretty fun. Mimetic Betrayal is a 3-mana sorcery. Exile all cards from all opponents' graveyards. You may cast those cards this turn, and you may spend mana as though it were mana of any type to cast those spells. At the beginning of the next end step, if any of those cards remain exiled, return them to their owner's graveyards. So, from what I understand of how this card works, when you cast a card with Mimetic Betrayal, it goes right back into the graveyard. Because it's in exile. Like, it doesn't go to super exile. So, this isn't like graveyard hate. All of your opponent's cards in their graveyard go back into their graveyard, regardless of what you did with them, after the spell resolves. So you essentially get to pay 3 mana to then cast as many spells from your opponent's graveyard as you have mana to cast, is essentially what this card does. Which is a little memey, but we may have like certain matchups where that's good, depending upon how certain things play out. This may be a plausible sideboard card, but in general, this type of effect is not super strong. It can give you a lot of value, depending upon how much mana you have. Like, if you have a lot of mana, Mimetic Betrayal is very strong. It's possible that the big 5-color ramp decks win condition ends up being Mimetic Betrayal. I guess I wouldn't be shocked by that. But in general, I think it's a little too cute for constructed, but I'm not like confident about that. I would totally be willing to eat my words if this card showed up in a top 8, even though I do not think that that is particularly likely. Nightveil Predator. This is the Dimir part of the cycle. Has my favorite keyword. It 4 mana, Flying Death Touch, and Hexproof. 3/3. So this card is a little bit of a better implementation of Hexproof, although that's like saying like a little bit better of a dumpster fire, like splitting hairs, like you just shouldn't print Hexproof anymore. But if you're going to, putting it in a color where you can't put stuff on it, and on a creature that can't pressure your opponent that effectively, it only has 3 power, is in the ballpark of what you should be doing with Hexproof. This card is bonkers, nutso busted, and limited. And in constructed can certainly show up just because it stonewalls the universe. It just sits there with Flying and Death Touch. If you want to attack into it, your thing is going to die. You can't get it out of the way because it has Hexproof. So if you're trying to bridge to the mid and late game in a Dimir deck, this helps you. And it can clock your opponent, albeit slowly, because it's very hard to deal with. It has evasion and Hexproof. So I'm having trouble seeing the exact shell that Nightveil Predator goes into. It may be the aggro-y Surveil deck as just a 4-drop, because that deck doesn't really have other 4-drops as far as I can think of. But on raw rate, this card is certainly strong enough to see competitive play. It's just more so a matter of what does it go in? Like, what wants this card? And I don't necessarily have a good answer to that question yet. Notion Rain. This is one of my favorite cards in the set. Notion Rain is colorless, blue-black sorcery. Surveil 2, then draw 2 cards. Notion Rain deals 2 damage to you. So anyone who's played Magic for a little bit will know that this is Read the Bones, except better because it has Surveil instead of Scry, although it is in Dimir instead of straight black, so rip Jund. But so Read the Bones was an exceptionally powerful Magic card that kind of went underappreciated during its standard legality. Getting 4 cards deep for 3 mana is massive. We've seen the power level of Glimmer of Genius over the past 2 years, and granted, Glimmer of Genius also got energy. That was an additional resource. It was like virtual card advantage, and sometimes like actual card advantage. But this being 1 mana less, and having Surveil, which plays into your graveyard synergies, enables a lot of stuff for you. This is gonna like just set everything up you want to do. It enables like all the Surveil triggers that like your spy bugs or whatever have. If you're just playing it in a fair deck, you're gonna hit your land drops all the time. You can flip over spells to like cast a mission briefing or jumpstart stuff. This card is a really solid role player at enabling your deck. It's one of my favorite cards. I'm excited to play with it. It's one of the reasons that I might be shifting over to Sultai instead of Jund for this iteration of Ravnica, depending on what we get from Rakdos and Gruul. But I love Notion Rain. I love playing with this card. The life gain is life loss is notable, but there are some things to help mitigate it with Blood Operative, for example. So you can mitigate that to a degree, and it's honestly worth it. So I like Notion Rain a lot. It has a pedigree in Read the Bones for being a powerful constructed card, and I do believe that will continue moving forward. Here's the good one. This is probably a top 3 most powerful card in the set. Thief of Sanity is a colorless blue-black 2/2 with flying. Whenever Thief of Sanity deals combat damage to a player, look at the top 3 cards of that player's library. Exile one of them face down, and put the rest into their graveyard. For as long as that card remains exiled, you may look at it, you may cast it, and you may spend mana as though mana of any color to cast it. This is our new Nightveil Spectre, and for anyone who played in last Ravnica, you are certainly well familiar with how busted Nightveil Spectre was. That card just ran away with games by itself, and this card is circumstantially better, circumstantially worse, but certainly in the same ballpark. It is notable that your opponent does not get to see the cards you take. This is a Gonti trigger. It's pretty much the same thing as Gonti, except instead of bottom of the deck, the excess cards go into the graveyard. So there is the incidental downside of potentially enabling your opponent's graveyard synergies, but just continuing to go up cards is a big deal. Also, Nightveil Spectre had the clause to cast the cards on the card itself. So if Night Veil Spectre died, you couldn't use the cards it had accrued. That is not the case with Thief of Sanity. You can cast the cards that you got with Thief of Sanity, regardless of whether or not Thief of Sanity is still in play. That is a big deal. You can like stockpile them. You're not obligated to cast them earlier than you're comfortable. This card just can run away with the game. It has to be answered, or your opponent is just going to get buried. And cards that put that much pressure on your opponent that early are very strong. This is one of the card I was talking about that synergizes very well with Lazav, for example. If you have this in the yard and you have a Lazav, you can just immediately convert that Lazav into value if your opponent does not block. It's just a very, very powerful card that is going to not be format defining necessarily because it's just a 2/2, but it's something you're going to have answers to. You can't just like go into a constructed game and like not be able to beat a Windrake. You have to be able to beat a Windrake, because if you don't beat the Windrake is going to dumpster you. So it's not that hard to beat the Windrake, but you gotta put in the effort to beat the Windrake. Thought Erasure is our next Dimir card, and it's a good one. It is a blue-black sorcery. Target opponent reveals their hand. You may choose a non-land card from it. That player discards that card. Surveil 1. So this is Thoughtseize for 2 mana. That is obviously a lot more mana than Thoughtseize. Like, it's 100% more mana. That's a big number. But the effect of Thoughtseize is very powerful. 2 mana is still in the range of being able to cast it before your opponent deploys all their things. You can get their important cards out of their hand before they're able to cast them. And you have the added benefit of being able to surveil 1 with this card, which is some percentage of card advantage. It also increases this card's floor when you top deck it. Generally, the liability with running discard is they are dead top decks in the late game. At minimum, this card lets you surveil 1, getting a card deeper when you're in that top deck mode. So I like Thought Erasure a lot. There is precedent for 2 mana discard spells seeing play in standard. 2 mana discard spells quite a bit worse than this one. Transgress the Mind, I believe it was. That was a card we actually like main decked, if I'm remembering correctly, and Thought Erasure is probably better. So this is a card you can certainly main deck. If not, depending upon how aggressive the format ends up being, for example, if Boros ends up being the boogeyman, don't know if that'll be the case, but assume it is, then Thought Erasure is not a card you can probably main deck, although even in that case, you're still taking stuff like Aurelia, which are very powerful cards from them. So this is a card that's power level depends greatly upon the speed of the format. There will be formats that are too fast for this card to be main deckable, but assuming everything is as slow as it should be, given how small the format is, Thought Erasure is going to be one of the better cards that you can play in the early turns of the game. Unmoored Ego is colorless blue-black sorcery. Choose a card name, search target opponent's graveyard, hand, and library for up to 4 cards with that name, and exile them. That player shuffles their library and then draws a card for each card exiled from their hand this way. So this is the new Lost Legacy cranial extraction thing. This one is templated in such a way where you could take lands. The reason it couldn't be worded like this before without the up to four clause is you could name like Island and take all the lands out of your opponent's deck. But this one, they wanted it to be able to hit lands, partially for Modern. You can hit Tron stuff with this. But also in Standard, there's some applications. So I do like that this has that application. And it's just going to be a reasonable sideboard card. Like if things get too linear or whatever, you have this option. It's the same thing as Lost Legacy. In some formats it was unplayable, in some formats it was like really, really good. It depends upon what's going on. So this is just like a safety valve to make sure that like if there's another Aetherworks Marvel or something, this is a bit of a stopgap against that. So it's just an effect that exists in every format. This one's a little bit different in the fact that it can hit lands and is specifically Dimir instead of mono black. That is notable. But in general, this will just be a very solid sideboard card. Whisper Agent. Whisper Agent is a 3 mana 3/2 flash. When Whisper Agent enters the battlefield, surveil 1. This is a pretty solid limited card. Not really convinced we need to be doing this in Constructed. I feel like there is better 3-drops, as we just saw in our new Night Veil Spectre. So I am interested in these next 2 cards, Connive and Concoct. So Connive is a 4 mana, 2 of which are hybrid blue, black sorcery. Gain control of target creature with power 2 or less. You'll like, first thing that comes to mind is Aurelia. Aurelia is a really, really, really good thing to hit with Connive. Also, the Night Veil Spectre. That's another really good card to hit with Connive. I'm sure there's other ones, but those are the first 2 that come to mind, and even just those 2 alone across 2 different archetypes, probably enough to make this card good. Especially, like, even if you didn't have the other side of this in Concoct, which is a 5 mana sorcery, Surveil 3, then return a creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Some things to note with Concoct. You Surveil 3 first, and then it does not target a card. Because of this templating, Mission Briefing has this as well, where they want you to be able to surveil, and then if you hit the thing you want to hit off the surveil, you can immediately reanimate it. There's no window for your opponent to hit that specific target. So you just get to bring the thing back immediately. So this is a reanimation spell that they can respond to Concoct being on the stack, but once it resolves, once you're surveilling, it's too late. They can't exile it anymore. So if the thing you want to hit is in the top 3, it just happens. There's no window. So that's like a really strong element of Concoct. And the fact that it's just a reanimation spell is also pretty solid, especially a reanimation spell that surveils 3. That's like almost a card. I think like people have done the math on this. Scry 3 is about where it gets in the ballpark of being worth a card, especially the way it synergizes with the card it's enabling. So this card is very strong on both sides. You could build a deck that is more centralized on using Concoct, and then in the situations where Connive is good, it's real good. So that's how I would expect to use this card and how I would prefer to use this card. Build around Concoct being good, and then you just are free-rolling Connive to like blow out Aurelia. That seems like the best way to use this card, and a very powerful way to use this card. This is another really good one. Discovery and Dispersal. So Discovery is 1 in a hybrid Dimir sorcery. Surveil 2, then draw a card. So it is 2 mana Preordain. One of the most powerful cantrips ever printed. Granted, again, this costs 1 more. Same as Thought Erasure. Take one of the most powerful spells ever printed, make it cost 1 more. It's a running theme in this set. There's like a few examples of it. But you still get the same text box, which is cool. And Dispersal, which is a 5 mana instant. Each opponent returns a non-land permanent they control with the highest converted mana cost among those permanents they control to their hand, then discards a card. So the more important card on this is Discovery. Discovery is one of the better cantrips available in the format. Preordain has like a pretty solid pedigree. The fact that this is 2 mana obviously makes it slower, but Standard on the whole is a slower format, so in general that's going to be fine. And this is like in line with the other 2 mana cantrips you're already playing, like Chart the Course and Anticipate. Chart sees 2 cards, but kind of 3 because you get to discard a bad one. Anticipate sees 3, this sees 3. It's in line with those other cards, except this one also enables your graveyard stuff via Surveil. So this plus Chart the Course seems like a really good tandem of cantrips to enable like graveyard stuff in Dimir, if that's something you're in the business of doing. And then if you get into the late game, you actually can use Dispersal to deal with certain permanents. You actually have your cantrip be a thing that matters. You can have Dispersal bounce the card, and then if that's their only card, they have to discard it, or you're just like getting value. You're impacting the board, and it trades neutral card economy-wise because they have to discard something. Dispersal is like pretty narrow, but again, you're free-rolling it off of Discovery. Discovery is the main card you care about playing, and then every once in a while, you'd be like, hey, this is a pretty good spot for Dispersal. I guess I'll do that. So I like this card a lot. Also notable the fact that mono black gets Preordain. That's like an important thing to note about this card. You don't have to like have Dispersal online. You could literally just play Discovery in black. Like that's a totally reasonable thing to do, and a thing I think a lot of people will do because of how like good it is to have a cantrip that's strong in black. That's not traditionally something you get to do. So this card is definitely gonna show up a bunch, even in decks that like don't have blue mana. Like I would play this in Jund. So I am really hyped for Discovery. I think it's like one of the stronger enablers in the set, and I like it a lot.